Thank you. Just out of interest, just so I know who I'm talking to, how many people here are from policing agency? Oh, good numbers. And how many people are from academic organisations? And how many others in the room? Oh, nice. Yeah, just. And where are you from, though?
Office of Police Integrity.
Oh, okay, so not quite police, but sort of policing police. Yeah. All right. Hey, so what I don't know how many people were there. Many people here last night as well at the opening function. So it might be a little bit of repetition, but hopefully not too much. I'm just going to talk to you today a little bit about one of the studies I did as a PhD student, which was towards the end of last year. I've just sort of submitted my PhD at the end of last year. But as a bit of context, whilst I was doing my PhD, I was actually working for police at the same time. And I wanted to make sure that the research I did was really relevant to what we were doing in police and really address some real issues that were happening out there. So I'm just going to talk you through some studies and how I went about through the study and talk about how I went about that and just about evidence-based practice and about trying to answer real justice sector problems using evidence-based practice, because I think, you know, as policing organisations, that's what we want to do. We want to sort of, if we have best practice, if research can show us what best practice is, then we obviously want to adopt that so that we can improve what we're doing and have better justice sector outcomes. So I'm going to be talking it from that perspective. So in terms of researcher practitioner collaboration, I suppose very much part of this is my own story as both a researcher and as a practitioner, but also, and as I'll refer to throughout the presentation, much of what, because I was very actively involved in interviewing at the time and working very closely with judges and lawyers and investigators and interviewers and policymakers and legislators and so forth, very much what I did and how I did it was informed by my discussions with those people and working at what the current issues were around and what was going on through that. So I'll skip through on to the next. So what I'm going to do very briefly, I'm just going to, obviously with 15 minutes, it's just going to be a very brief overview of most things. Firstly, I'm going to just talk about the difficulty in prosecuting rape cases, because that sort of lays the context to the work that I've done. Then look at how we can improve eyewitness testimony and memory recall. And I'm talking about that in the context of the evidence or the information a rape complainant has, because when we're asking a rape complainant to recall information they have, we're asking them to conduct a memory recall exercise. And then I'm going to have a look at the evidence comparison we did, which is looking at comparing a rape complainant's police interview, the content of that police interview, with their live evidence they later give in the courtroom. And then I'm going to talk about implications for practice. And the whole sort of context of this being that, the idea being that looking at using the video recorded interviews that police do with rape complainants, using those same interviews as the basis for a rape complainant's evidence. But I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a moment. So firstly, the difficulty in prosecuting rape cases. I mean, you will no doubt probably most be familiar in the room will be familiar with this. The conviction rates for rape are low. That's not necessarily that of those cases that get to trial. I think over 50% do result in guilty convictions, but there's very large rates of attrition before getting to trial. And I think it's about, some of the research that Kathleen Daly did, about 11.5% of cases that are reported actually result in a guilty conviction. So you're looking at about 1 in 10 rape complainants actually having the offender held accountable. And saying that, of course, some alleged offenders aren't guilty and should be found innocent, or should be found not guilty. So you sort of that's amongst it. But I think there's a general consensus out there that there's probably more guilty offenders that walk free than innocent ones that get convicted in the nature of these sorts of cases. And that's something the justice sector has continuously tried to respond to, and I think struggled to respond to. I think we're getting larger reporting rates, but the conviction rates are pretty steady. Now, there's some very good, there are some reasons for this, for the low conviction rates, and one of those is that it's very often one person's word against the other. And to reach the evidential threshold required of beyond reasonable doubt is difficult in those circumstances, because very often all you have is the complainant's testimony, and that's all the jury has to decide on the facts of the case. And that makes it very difficult to reach that threshold. Another thing is that when the evidence is ambiguous, and as is often the case in rape cases, because more than often than not, the defence is consent, and that's always a difficult issue for the jury to work through. But when the evidence is ambiguous, there's a growing body of research out there that that suggests that jurors often will rely on rape myths, which tend to place blame on the complainant. And that's things like, she shouldn't have gone back to his house with him because she knows if she goes back to his apartment that he's going to expect sex, so she sort of volunteered to do that, so therefore, she's blameworthy, she's an equal participant in this, even if she said sort of no on the night. And things or she was drinking and she was intoxicated, so therefore she deserved what happened, or she didn't resist and she could have resisted, so therefore it's her fault. This sort of thinking seems to be going on. And it seems to be one of the things that sort of bias juror decision-making perhaps unfairly against the complainant. So in the system where we've got one person's evidence very often, that being the complainant's and not much else, obviously an ideal justice sector response is to optimise the quality of that evidence that we actually do have, and to do everything that the justice sector can to ensure that the processes are in place to make sure that happens. And for a complainant testimony, that's about increasing the completeness and accuracy of their account, and also potentially providing information that might help counter these rape myths so that a jury can understand why a complainant behaved in the way that she behaved. So that's the basic context. Moving on to video recorded evidence, just so that you understand what this means and a little bit about this. Video recorded evidence is simply, I suppose it's sort of almost cutting out one phase of the process, but what it involves is police video recording the interview in the first place with the rape complainant. And I think many police services around the world are, and part of why I started conducting this research is that in New Zealand we started video recording our rape complainant interviews as a way to improve the process for rape complainants, but also as a way to ensure that we captured the most complete and accurate information from them, because obviously that information is not just vital to a jury, but it's vital to an investigation. So it's about using that video and actually playing that video that was conducted during the investigation to the jury at trial. And in that form of evidence, the video is played, any additional questions are asked by the prosecutor, any supplementary questions, and it's followed by cross-examination. And obviously questions from the judge or any re-examination as well. So that's the process that I'm talking about. And there's some really good reasons as to why using that police interview as the basis for the complainant's evidence in chief might help to improve the completeness and accuracy of the account that's given to the court. And the first, there's three main reasons, and I'm going to touch on each briefly. The first is delay. It's well established in psychological science that the greater the distance between the event and a memory recall, there is a great loss. There's a loss in information. Memory deteriorates over time. So one of the benefits of using the video record is it captures a fresher account from the complainant. And because of the loss of memory over time, that account is likely to be more complete. So it's likely to be further up here rather than down here. More information might be lost. So that's one effect of time, is this, the effect of forgetting. The other thing is, it's pretty well established in psychological research that memory is a reconstructive process. And because of that, it is vulnerable to distortion. So memories change over time, just as a matter of course that can happen. So the other benefit of using the video record, it eliminates the risk of memory deterioration that might occur between the interview and trial, because there may well be some deterioration that occurs then that may actually change the quality of the information that's remembered as well. So that's the first one, it's delay. So the video captures a fresher account, which should improve the completeness and accuracy. The second reason why the video interview might contain more complete and accurate information is the methods that are used. So police are trained, or certainly in New Zealand they're trained, and I'm sure they are in most places around the world, in using questioning techniques that enhance the completeness and accuracy of the information that's given. And these techniques are all evidence-based, are basically what evidence-based practice is. They're techniques based on psychological science about how to optimise the completeness and accuracy of memory recall. Fundamental to all these interviewing protocols, or how police are supposed to interview, is the use of open questions. They're sort of the cornerstone to good interviewing, to the good interviewing of witnesses. And these open questions encourage narrative responses. So they're the sorts of questions that, you ask someone, tell me everything that happened, or describe that to me in as much detail as you can. And the idea is that you try and encourage the witness to provide a narrative response, and in doing that, the research suggests it encourages more elaborate or more detailed memory recall. To encourage these narrative responses, the other benefit of it is when you ask open questions like that, you're asking the witness to retrieve information from memory as they do it best. You're asking them to search their memory in their own way, and you're passing control of the interview to the witness. And by allowing the witness to search memory in their own way, this also promotes the accuracy and completeness of memory recall. But part and integral to that is also giving instructions to the witness, saying things like it's okay if you report it in your own order and in your own time, and that might not be chronological. So that 5 minutes already. Is it to go? Yeah. Okay. All right. Jesus. All right. Moving along. So yeah. So there's different. There's more narrative approaches, and this is in contrast to advocacy methods, which encourage sound chunks of information or short pieces of information. Now, by asking questions that encourage short responses, you're likely to get less detailed information by using those sorts of questions. And advocates use those questions for reasons of presentation, because they believe that there's a perception that sound chunks of information are more digestible to a jury or more impactful on a jury, and also so that they don't render any inadmissible evidence. But they're in stark contrast to the witness interviewing techniques because of the short responses and because the questioner highly controls the witness. The third reason why a video interview might be better evidence is also because of the negative effects of stress and memory. Basically, memory has a negative effect on, stress has a negative effect on memory. So in the more relaxed environment of the interview room, you might probably like to get more complete information again. And also because of the formal expectations of the court environment may discourage a witness from reporting in detail, because we don't normally report in detail when we're having a formal conversation about something. So the issue with video evidence is that legislation in New Zealand, England, Norway and Wales and in Northern Territory in Australia allows us to use this evidence with adults, but it is seldom used. And when you ask legal professionals why it's seldom used, they say they think it will improve accuracy and completeness, but they're concerned about the impact of the video. Not just the video, but the narrative format of the interview. So it's seldom being used. So what we wanted to do is work out, well, okay, we've got all these theoretical reasons as to why the memory recall in the video might be better than live evidence. But if there's not much difference, then there may be little incentive to increase the use of video evidence. In fact, there might be no need to. However, if there is a bigger difference, then it might be that we need to look more about how we actually give evidence and what way of evidence we use, and that maybe we should be using the more video. So what I did is gathered transcripts from court cases held over 1 year in 2 areas of New Zealand. It was originally 3 areas, but Christchurch suffered a devastating earthquake, so they had to be removed from the sample. So I got all the rape cases that resulted in trial from those areas. And what we did is compared the transcripts of the video recorded interview of the complainant and the content of those transcripts with the transcripts of their live evidence in chief. So what we did is we looked at the content. How does the content differ between the video interview and the live evidence? And we looked at several things. We looked at consistency. So what details are the same and what are different between the video and live evidence? We looked at the type of details, the types of questions used, and the response lengths. And when I say we looked at consistency, what we looked at consistency only, we looked at the central details. So anything that went towards what happened during the alleged offence. So from the moment of he pushed me onto the bed to the moment of he rolled over and fell asleep. So what actually happened during the offence, and anything that happened prior to the offence that could have gone towards consent. So things like, I told him I didn't want him near me. So that's the sort of detail we looked at. And what we found was this. 2/3 of the information in the interview never made it to trial. So that's this figure here. 2/3 of it was omitted. This was repeated consistently, and then there were a small number of distortions and contradictions, but not many. And then the prosecutor elicited some new evidence. So it was quite a huge amount. That was statistically significant. And because it was obviously it's a small sample size, but because it was such a strong effect, it reached levels of statistical significance. And as you can see, it's quite a big difference. 2/3 of it never made it to the jury. And these are things like, conversations that we had around consent and so forth. So there was a huge diminishing of information. Next thing, we looked at the different types of information that was lost, and this is a bit of a confusing graph, but basically we broke it down, all the details we broke them down to different categories, either physical actions that happened, or verbal, so those are conversations that were had, cognitions, so that's what the complainant was thinking, emotion, the complainant describing her emotions or the defendant's emotions, and surround descriptions, which were least common. But what we found is basically all these different attributes suffered a huge loss of information between interview and trial. And that's the huge loss that you can see here, the high peaks. That's the consistent information, that's the loss of information. But what we also found is what suffered the greatest loss were actually cognitions. And so these cognitions were things like, I didn't fight back because I was afraid that if I fought back, he'd become even more violent. And I think this is going to be maybe a really interesting area of research, because these cognitions may be things that might be really useful for a jury in trying to understand and might help to dispel the rape myths that juries hold, because they're trying to seek an explanation for the complainant's behaviour and they can't understand why she behaved how she did. So if you can give the complainant, if she can provide her rationalisation for that, as is recommended in a case construction approach to prosecutions, then that may assist the jury reach just decisions. I've run out of time. Right. Anyway, but basically, what I'll say very briefly about that too, we found that basically what contributed to the differences, we think, in the amount of information is that police gained about 5 times the amount of information to the open questions, so they were getting these free narrative responses. So it's very likely that the narrative responses are contributing to those differences in information found, which leads us on to looking at more questions as to how now we know what the differences are, how does the actual interview format affect perceptions of the evidence, which is the next question that really needs to be answered to determine as to whether it's going to be useful to use those videos as evidence. Right, I might just leave it at that.